In this explainer, we're going to tackle a fascinating and, well, a deeply human puzzle. Why is it that long after a crisis is over, we still act like we're right in the middle of it?
And that really is the central paradox, isn't it? The data might show a recovery, profits could be bouncing back, the immediate threat is gone. But there's this ghost of that risk that just hangs around, and it influences our choices in these profound and often, frankly, counterproductive ways. So let's break down exactly how this happened. All right, to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to look at 5 key areas. We'll start with what we're calling the survival hangover, then move into the anxious mind, followed by the cautious organization. After that, we'll explore the economics of waiting, and we'll finish up with the persistence loop, which, as you'll see, ties everything together.
Okay, so first up, the survival hangover. Let's define what this core issue really is. What exactly is this hangover from being in survival mode?
Right, so the formal term for this is, and it's a bit of a mouthful, cognitive and organizational hysteresis. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, a good way to think about it is like a magnetic field that sticks around even after you've taken the magnet away. That memory of risk, it essentially becomes the new default operating system, and it's guiding decisions long after the environment has completely changed.
So let's zoom in a bit. We'll move from the big picture to the individual level and see how this all builds from the ground up, starting right inside our own brains. Because a crisis doesn't just pass through us, you see. It actually leaves a neurological footprint.
Okay, now this is really fascinating. There's a fundamental imbalance in how our brains learn. Think about it. We're hardwired to learn about threats very quickly and very permanently. It's an old evolutionary advantage, right? But learning that something is safe, well, that's a much more fragile, a much slower process. And here's the crucial part. Research shows that stress, the very thing you experience during a crisis, actively disrupts our ability to form and remember that things are safe again. So what happens after a crisis? Our brain is left in this weird state where the threat signal is still blaring loud and clear, but the all-clear signal is, well, it's muffled. And this heightened focus on threats gets even worse because of something called scarcity tunneling. It's exactly what it sounds like. When we feel a lack of something, it could be time, money, or just mental capacity, our mind focuses intensely on that one immediate problem. We basically enter a tunnel, and everything that's outside of that tunnel, things like long-term strategic planning, they just fade from view. Now, this tunneling isn't free. It comes with a real cognitive cost, what researchers call the bandwidth tax. It literally reduces our fluid intelligence, our ability to solve new problems. It impairs our executive control. To give you a sense of how powerful this is, some research shows that just worrying about your finances can hit your cognitive performance harder than pulling an all-nighter. And here's the kicker. This happens even when the scarcity is just perceived. It's not necessarily real. And that's what locks us into this vicious cycle, the scarcity trap, where our focus on immediate survival stops us from doing the long-term thinking we need to actually. Okay, so that's what's happening inside our own heads. But how does that scale up? How does it translate to the companies and organizations we're all a part of? Well, this is the point where individual fear starts to become institutional policy. One of the main ways this happens is through something called audit creep. You've probably seen this. In response to a crisis, an organization creates all these new layers of oversight. More checks, more balances, more reporting. They're meant to be temporary fire breaks, but they're almost never temporary, are they? They stick around and become part of the permanent bureaucratic furniture long after the fire has gone out. And the consequences of this are pretty significant. A culture of defensive decision-making starts to take root. People stop asking, what's the best thing to do for the organization? And instead, they start asking, what's the decision that will protect me from getting blamed? And this leads to what's called organizational silence, because nobody wants to be the one to deliver bad news in that environment. And it leads to blame shifting, where everyone just pushes responsibility onto some neutral body, like the compliance department, to avoid having to be accountable. And the scale of this problem is, well, it's staggering. Studies suggest that somewhere between 20 and 50%, a fifth to a half, of all major managerial decisions are defensive. Just let that sink in for a moment. Up to half of a company's strategic brainpower isn't being used to create value. It's being used to avoid blame. All right, let's pull back again. We've gone from the brain to the organization. Now let's look at the wider economy. How does this collective survival mindset show up in big picture macroeconomic behavior?
This table here tells a really clear story. If you look at the pre-pandemic period, firms were holding cash mostly to fund future investments. They were on the lookout for new opportunities. But after a crisis, that whole motive shifts. Cash stops being about opportunity and starts being a precautionary buffer. So even when profits start to climb again, companies are much less willing to spend that money. They're just hoarding it, preparing for the next crisis instead of investing in the recovery that's happening right now. This is driven by a powerful economic idea called the option value of waiting. It's pretty simple, really. When uncertainty is high, the act of not making a decision, not investing, not hiring anyone, becomes a valuable option in and of itself. Why? Because keeping your cash liquid and your options open just feels safer than committing to a path that feels risky. And when everyone does this at once, well, you get widespread economic stagnation.
And you see this play out even in places that are supposedly designed for this exact kind of scenario. Take banks. They were encouraged to dip into their capital buffers during the pandemic to keep lending money. But they didn't. And why not? Because they were terrified the market would see it as a sign of weakness and punish them for it. So the very tool that was designed to provide flexibility in a crisis just sits there, locked away, all because of the fear of how it would look.
Okay, so we've seen the psychological roots in the brain, the inertia inside organizations, and the paralysis in the wider economy. So for our final section, let's bring it all together and see how these forces lock each other into a really powerful, self-reinforcing loop. Let's just walk through the steps one by one. It starts with a crisis, rewiring our brains for threat vigilance. That leads to cognitive tunneling, which eats up our mental bandwidth and narrows our focus to the immediate short term. Next, our organizations react by baking in defensive governance, all that audit creep we talked about. This, in turn, fuels that risk-off economic behavior across the board, like hoarding cash instead of investing. And then, and this is the really crucial final step, that stagnant activity, which is a direct result of our collective caution, gets interpreted as proof that the world is still a dangerous place, which, of course, just validates the initial fear, and the whole cycle starts over again.
And so that leaves us with a final, and I think, quite a powerful question to consider. In a world that's so often shaped by the memory of the last crisis, we really have to ask ourselves, are our decisions, our personal ones, the ones in our companies, the ones we make as a society, are they actually being guided by the opportunities of today? Or are we still letting ourselves be held captive by the ghosts of yesterday?